the topic for today is, and that's a two-front war that India could potentially face. So before the Chinese aggression in May of this year, there had been different sort of viewpoints on whether a two-front war is a reality or not. While the military has almost always been saying that we need to we need to prepare for a two-front threat of China and Pakistan, there were also members of the strategic community who felt that the military is sort of hyping up this threat. And they're hyping up this threat just to get, more resources within the military, to get a bigger pie of the defense budget. However, it's my feeling that, this latter viewpoint that the two-front threat is not a reality was also to some extent supported by the political and diplomatic community, who felt that at least the Chinese threat could be politically and diplomatically handled, and that it wouldn't really translate, towards military action by China. I think this sentiment was also reinforced by the fact that the LAC, with China, had remained fairly dormant and calm since 1975. There had been agreements starting from early 90s, protocols and agreements which guided detailed conduct of soldiers on both sides, and that had held peace. And despite the fact that you had incursions and standoffs in 2013, 2014, and 2017, I think the feeling was that all these have got resolved peacefully. There may have been periods of tension, but the fact is military action on the LAC did not take place. I think some of this notion is now getting challenged after what has happened in May. We have major Chinese incursions into eastern Ladakh. There's a very heavy buildup of troops on both sides. There's talk of about 50,000 soldiers on either side of the LAC in Ladakh, which is a significant buildup by Chinese regular forces into Tibet. On the other side, on the line of control, we have seen a deterioration in situation in the last 5 years or so. Massive ceasefire violations, infiltrations continue. We've had the latest one was at Nagrota, where 4 terrorists came in through a tunnel in the Jammu sector. There is also much greater sort of closer strategic cooperation between China and Pakistan. Military level contacts are increasing. The CPEC is there, which further sort of solidifies this relationship between the two countries. So now the sense is that even if a two-front war is not looming on the horizon, the threat has become much more real than it was in the past. And so with this backdrop, some of the questions that have been framed to the panelists were, does India face an immediate two-front threat? To what degree are India's fears of a China-Pak nexus valid? Will it actually translate into reality? Questions about, does India have the capability currently to actually meet a two-front challenge? And then the fact that, when you're talking about two-front war, you're talking about 3 countries engaging in a war, 3 countries that are in possession of nuclear weapons. And so what is the role of nuclear deterrence? What are the prospects for nuclear stability in South Asia in the event of a two-front war? Role of politics and diplomacy in case of military escalation? And finally, what could be the role of external actors and how a two-front conflict could actually impact regional geopolitics? So these are some of the questions that have been framed to the panelists. So I'll request, opening comments by each of the panelists for about 10 to 12 minutes. You can cover any of these, all these subjects, depending on the way you wish to give out your comments. We'll start with Dr. Isha, go on to Brigadier Sehgal, Dr. Tarapur, and finally Amignan. So I'll request 10 to 12 minutes for each, and then after that, we'll go into a Q&A session. So may I request Dr. Isha, please, to start.
Right. Thank you, Chair, for giving me this opportunity. Also, I thought that made much more sense that, I heard the Indian perspective first, but doesn't matter. Um, Again, it's nice to be with colleagues from India or experts working on the region to talk about what may, what could happen, what is the likelihood. Um, it's interesting, that I sit to talk about a two-front situation for India when one has grown up hearing of a two-front situation in case of Pakistan. I mean, earlier it was on the Pakistani side was always India and Afghanistan. Now it's we're talking about sitting and talking about India and Pakistan. Sorry, China and Pakistan joining against India. Uh, Now, despite that, and so the assumption is that at some point in time there will be configuration, there will be war at both the line of actual control and line of control. LAC and LOC can come together. Um, the perception from Pakistan is, and one would try to figure out that what is Pakistan's perspective on that. Firstly, any policy that is that is made in Pakistan is driven by an understanding of where the change in India itself. There is that fear, in fact, kind of multiplied, that the BJP government, which had promised to change. I mean, earlier on there was all of this talk of engagement, conversation, etc. But I think for Pakistan, what changed was Kashmir and Article 370, and it has begun to take India, or the threat that Indian manifesto, BJP's manifesto, how it would play out much more seriously. So the question in Pakistan's mind is that what? They promised to change the status of Kashmir they have. They're talking about Aksai Chin. Amit Shah spoke in the parliament, in the Indian parliament, about Aksai Chin. So where does it lead them? And thirdly, the BJP has been talking about Gilgit-Baltistan, the new map, etc. So what are these threats? And Pakistan would appreciate the regional situation from the perspective of what it means for Pakistan, the threat it poses for Pakistan. What if there is an intention, real intention, for India to invade Gilgit-Baltistan? That is its perspective, and that's where it would come together much more with China. I think it's also important to go back, from that moment, if we retrack our steps and see history, we'd notice that up until now, China had always instructed Pakistan, and had always advised Pakistan, more than instructed, the wrong word, advised Pakistan to actually keep tension down with India, to keep it manageable. Let's not forget Kargil. Kargil, when Pakistan was eager, it had eagerly made the move. Um, it was in fact China, and China's advice that Pakistan should withdraw, that Pakistan did withdraw. That was a help it had hope for, which it didn't get, and therefore there was withdrawal. I heard General Huda talk about CPEC, and I heard him speak about Pakistan-China cooperation. Of course, this is not a new cooperation. This is a relationship which goes back to, I would say, it began in 1955 and has progressed. As far as CPEC is concerned, CPEC, if you look at Pakistan's internal assessment much more carefully, CPEC itself it's a political economic relationship which is not gone very far. In fact, people in Pakistan are less hopeful about CPEC. I mean, it's a mild relationship. It's not a raging relationship. It's not the kind of new relationship which it started with a lot of excitement. Its peak was 2017. Now it has slowed down to a pace which is manageable for both in a way, China and Pakistan. It's not, and that is, and it has been brought to a pace where it would allow Pakistan a dialogue with the United States. Pakistan does not want to lose that opportunity to not have a conversation with the United States, and therefore CPEC itself has been put at a speed where it doesn't kind of attract a lot of Western attention more than anywhere else. But coming back to China, I think for Pakistan, Pakistan stands at a moment when it can see that it's not going forward on Kashmir. The understanding in Pakistan's different circles is that there is a standstill kind of a situation from Pakistan's end. There is an expectation, but there is also the rising fear of what India will do, and therefore it makes a lot of sense. If China is going to move, and if China is going to pile up forces on the border with India, it is beneficial. It takes away, it attracts Indian resources, financial resources, military resources. It ties them up there, and which then kind of relieves pressure, a bit of pressure on Pakistan, and that's the angle from which it's looking. I don't think that there is this expectation that that China itself wants to kind of go towards a major war with India. It's not something feasible. This is not something that China would want to engage in. An all-out conventional war, China doesn't benefit, nor does Pakistan. Especially at a time when the Middle East is kind of getting very exciting in a different way, and challenges for Pakistan are substantial. But what to kind of come to the close of my presentation, I think for Pakistan the two-front situation is interesting from the perspective of the relief it provides Pakistan. I don't think that there is a major war that it's looking at. And one final point is that as far as this whole story of Pakistan-China cooperation is concerned, that cooperation has been going on for very long. I mean, from a point in the 1970s when Army started to build its dependency on Chinese equipment to now when the Air Force and Navy are also dependent on China. There is greater dependency, but that doesn't mean that there is interoperability. I mean, they're learning interoperability of forces, or that there is also a bit of a nervousness on allowing China greater intrusion into Pakistan. So Pakistan, while supporting China, as China supported Pakistan, it would be a careful support, and it would not want to be in a situation where it's kind of led into a conflict. It would like to draw maximum benefits. And at this point in time, I think the best thing which Pakistan can look at is increasing burden for India, something which Pakistan itself could not do all these years. China has much more money to spend. It has greater economic and military capacity as compared to India, and I think it will settle for that.
So thank you very much, Dr. Aisha. I think it's a fascinating perspective from Pakistan's viewpoint, because every country looks at what threats it are there to its country from its own perspective, and her viewpoint is that while Pakistan might be relieved that China is putting pressure on India, it does not necessarily mean that it will attempt to take an advantage of this or get itself led into some kind of a conflict. So thank you very much, Dr. Aisha. May I request Brigadier Sehgal?
For some reason, I think the host has stopped my video. But okay, I'll just carry on. So
Can you make him the host?
no, anyway, I'll carry on. Yeah, I'll come up subsequently.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so firstly, I want to thank Happy Moon and General Huda for this opportunity. I'll try and cover some of the important issues raised by General Huda in his opening remarks. Fundamentally, from my perspective, India has always faced two-front challenge, given the fact that we have unresolved borders with both these countries. A recent IDSA analysis highlights China had from the very beginning attempted to ingratiate itself in the J&K dispute. In collusion with then Pakistan establishment, it usurped the Galwan Valley in 1963, despite the fact that it had no historical claims. This, along with illegal annexation of Aksai China, has made China a party to the J&K dispute from the very beginning, a perspective that is now not fully understood in India, and that's the issue that IDSA study has highlighted. As far as Pakistan is concerned, as its economic difficulties have amplified, China has manipulated it both politically as well as in its pervasive establishment to strengthen its hold over Pakistan. The CPEC is the manifestation, as rightly brought up by General Huda, but it is also a fact that some recent reports indicate the large-scale presence of Chinese soldiers and Chinese workforce in Gilgit-Baltistan, and the whole logic of Daimler Bhasha Dam, which is a $3.4 billion investment, large-scale electricity production, keeping the routes from Xinjiang to Gwadar open are the manifestation of some of these, and we are aware of the fact that there is a large-scale military relationship. Pakistan is the only country which has purview to the Baidu's the military operational satellite links, which provides them with a great degree of geo-intelligence. In so far as China is concerned, it has always looked upon India as a second-tier threat that could be managed through measured political and economic engagement and nuanced coercion, particularly with regard to the boundary dispute, while maintaining series of CBMs enacted since 1993. Three factors have changed the Chinese perceptions lately. First is India's economic growth and strategic ambitions. Second, impetus on the border area infrastructure development. And lastly, the growing Indo-US strategic partnership. Indian leadership has been conscious of the China-Pakistan axis, which has generated both high security costs and raised the dangers of two-front war. India has sought to deal with this problem by, on one hand, underplaying the China challenge, which General also talked about, through engagement in CBMs designed to maintain peace and tranquility on the LAC, and while developing capabilities and capacities to deal with the most persistent challenger, Pakistan. The issue is what has changed. Chinese attempts to change the territorial status quo in Ladakh through its unprovoked aggression and subtle intimidatory moves in eastern sector and within the neighborhood has completely changed the narrative. There is now a more direct territorial challenge from China in addition to the one we have with Pakistan. These developments, marked by manifest challenge from China and Pakistan's hostility, is resulting in what is called the hard power-driven South Asia geopolitics amidst growing Sino-Pak convergence. Message is clear. India, as a standalone power, has to handle these challenges substantively on its own. India cannot count on its strategic partners beyond reasonable material and diplomatic support. In the case of US strategic equations, in the US, with the new administration are yet to be drawn, even as the signs of continuity are promising. So the next issue is, how do we see this collusion taking place? As I mentioned, China perceives India as a strategic adversary. Mutual distrust and embedded hostility have led to an understanding within the Chinese Communist Party and the political circles that India cannot be trusted as a reliable interlocutor. The deep-seated outlook of lack of trust is likely to guide future Chinese engagement with India. In addition, China has begun to look upon India as a quasi-US ally with little chance of preventing further deepening of India-US relations. Furthermore, with the regional competition intensifying and earlier systems of effective management of bilateral differences crumbling, differences turning into violent conflict is likely to be the new normal in the India-China relationship. Under these circumstances, the Sino-Pak military strategic collusion is only likely to increase in the future with the aim to constrain India both politically and strategically. China is shedding its neutrality on J&K and has begun to identify itself completely with Pakistan's Kashmir agenda. How will the challenge manifest? Conflict with China has graduated to third and the fourth generation military force. China has graduated to a third and fourth generation military force that is high-tech, net-centric, capable of fighting local wars under informationized conditions. Imperative of this is high degree of domain awareness, effect-based operation capability backed by cyber and information war capacities much beyond those of India. Therefore, attritional war will not be a matter of choice as it precludes exploiting its superior technological capabilities. However, given the prevailing boundary dispute and the standoff, it has little option but to fall back on what I call an attritional model, if at all, to gain any tactical advantage. Non-contact force application model is not an option in the present circumstances for China. In the attritional war, balance is not completely in China's favor, as the present standoff with India indicates. Moreover, in the prevailing ISR environment, attempts at escalation through larger force mobilization will lead to conventional deterrence breakdown, increasing possibilities of strategic escalation. Thus, China would prefer to employ, in my belief, techniques of intimidation or limited warfare to secure in its perceived objectives and manage escalation rather than seek large-scale conventional war with India. Insofar as Pakistan is concerned, a localized limited conflict scenario prevails. Resultantly, conflict will be based on attritional model in the second and third generation domains in the backdrop of nuanced nuclear overhang. Conflict will be restrained to lower thresholds and largely localized. The nature of conflict will include limited asymmetric hybrid, which is LIC, proxy, information, cyber war, etc., and some kind of gray zone operations. What will be the nature of Sino-Pak collusion? Strategic partnership between the two is signified by growing commercial infrastructure and military ties. We talked about the CPC already. Despite the growing concerns of Pakistan increasingly falling into the Chinese debt trap, owing to its economic hardships, Pak military is pushing an agenda for closer partnership with China as part of a containment strategy. This is supported by the so-called narrative of abrogation of Article 370, which the previous speaker also talked about, poses a joint challenge to the sovereignty of China and Pakistan. China has been categoric in denouncing the creation of Union Territory of Ladakh, claiming this act has opened a new territory on map incorporating parts of areas under the jurisdiction of Xinjiang and Tibet, forcing China into Kashmir dispute, stimulated China and Pakistan to take counteraction on the Kashmir issue. The Sino-Pak collusion will take the form of an ISR sharing, provocative force deployments, intimidating moves, forcing India to divert troops, etc. China, concerned about its global status, is unlikely to open a separate front against India in a scenario of Indo-Pak conflict. At best, what we can expect are some intimidatory moves and, of course, intelligence sharing, etc. Leasing of operational assets can also not be ruled out. On the other hand, in a conflict with China, Pakistan can be expected to undertake aggressive force posturing, escalating situation along the LAC. We have seen some of these actions during October and November this year, large-scale firing, etc. And intensive and defensive and offensive formations maneuvers cannot also be ruled out. Another area which is of concern to us is that apart from intelligence sharing is allowing PLAF of staging fuel facilities and opening up with air defense assets, particularly close to the line of actual control. It will support the Chinese actions. In my assessment, Pakistan will hesitate to open a second front against India, given India's punitive military capabilities and fast-paced modernization, tipping the military balance in India's favor. There is also the notion of a maritime challenge. While generally the two-front war is conceived as a continental domain, we have to recognize that the new challenge is emerging in the maritime domain. India thus far had a geographical advantage together with capable and balanced maritime capabilities that have allowed India to dominate the maritime domain so far. This is rapidly changing on account of two factors. First is the growing Chinese footprints and string of bases in the Indian Ocean as part of its Look West naval strategy. And second is the growing maritime capability of Pakistan as a consequence of Chinese support. What is the maritime threat perspective? India is cognizant of substantial increase in conventional maritime threat on account of Chinese naval buildup and enhanced deployment in IOR, particularly in the Bay of Bengal. Together with economic and infrastructure inducements, part of the MSR initiative, we feel that this threat is likely to become more manifest around the period of 2025-2030, when Chinese will be able to at least field a large-scale sea-based, carrier-based task force into the Indian Ocean. The next factor which I look at is the nuclear factor. The facet of nuclear backdrop is important in Indian security context, particularly as both Pakistan and China are not only nuclear weapon states, but maintain technical and operational collusion. Insofar as Pakistan is concerned, its doctrine of full spectrum deterrence includes nuclear war fighting and intimidation by professing first use through its single rank escalation strategy and by making its threshold shallow and explicit. So far as China is concerned, it is unlikely to use nuclear card. However, its present deployment in Tibet are capable of striking the entire Indian heartland that includes entire population centers of northern and eastern India, together with maritime space in the Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea. In addition, China possesses a strong non-conventional strike capability, rocket force, long-range cruise missiles, and hypersonic weapons. In addition, it possesses advanced nuclear weapons with MOV capabilities in the IRBM and ICBM range. Within the above backdrop, insofar as China is concerned, India has to reevaluate its strategic doctrine to create an intra-war doctrine based on clearly defined red lines as part of its conventional escalation strategy, invoking suitable strategic response if red lines are crossed. Lastly, the issue of external balancing. India is conscious that its path of capability development would require minimum decades or two to fully materialize. This requires India to develop a dependable balancing strategy by shedding its ambivalence and proactively leveraging its strategic partnerships such as quadrilateral. The move to induct Australia in the Marabar exercise is a step in the right direction. This is also the rationale behind strengthening bilateral defense and strategic partnership with the US and other quadrilateral partners. This is an imperative as a strategic hedge during the period of capability enhancement. India should seek value-based partnerships rather than alliances, which are an outdated concept. What should be the India overall strategy? Vis-a-vis China, I believe India's strategy is and should evolve into a dissuasive deterrence doctrine to escalate costs of any Chinese intervention against India. And with Pakistan, we should continue to build up our punitive deterrence to ensure that the conflict deterrence remains in place. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brigadier Sehgal. You've covered a lot of ground. I think if I can just very broadly sum it up, as opposed to Dr. Aisha, you feel that there is a greater scope for a two-front threat. It may not manifest, as you said, in full-scale conflicts on both sides, but certainly there would be some strategic kind of maneuvering and assistance given in case India gets involved on one front, so as to tie down Indian reserves and sort of movements on the other front. We can discuss this, in the Q&A a little more. You've also talked about, the nuclear factor and what India needs to do. and the kind of broad strategies that you want to adopt. On the nuclear issues, I will, take up a couple of questions once all the speakers are finished, because I think it's important, and enough attention is not being paid to the nuclear aspects when we are talking over two fronts. Right? So thank you very much, Brigadier Sehgal. May I now request Dr. Tarapur, please?
Hi, everyone. It is a distinct pleasure to be among this company. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to have a chat about this pretty important and pretty timely topic. I actually want to pick up where Brigadier Sehgal left off, which provided a really interesting and I think usefully nuanced view of what the two-front threat would actually look like at an operational level. But I want to take it one step further and talk about the prospects of really seeing the type of two-front threat that we often talk about. The type of two-front threat that I'm referring to is the threat that is envisioned in the Raksha Mantri directive of 30 days of intense warfare or 60 days of normal warfare as the primary or the worst case planning construct for the Indian military. This is, of course, as we know, the benchmark for procuring and maintaining war stocks. It's the benchmark for plans and exercises like the recent Gagan Shakti Air Force exercise, this idea of a high intensity conventional war. But my contention here, building off of what's just been said, is that actually that kind of two-front conventional war is India's choice. Fighting that kind of war would be a choice that is made in Delhi, not in Pindi or in Beijing. So let me explain what I mean by this. I would suggest, similar to what the Brigadier has argued, that the concept of a high intensity conventional war that is initiated by Pakistan and or China with the other collusive party piling on is highly unlikely. It has historically never happened. It's not even come close. And even if we take it as a possibility, even if we take the strategic intent as a possibility, my contention is that a high intensity conventional conflict is not how collusion would happen. So I'm not suggesting that these countries, don't harbor hostile intent towards India, and I'm not suggesting that there is not strategic cooperation between them, or as Indian planners would call it, collusion. From India's perspective, they are the aggressors, but it's not the two-front conventional conflict that India should be worried about. The reason for that is that, as both speakers already this evening have said, both Pakistan and China are in effect deterred from attacking India in that way because of the force densities on both sides of both borders, and because all parties are concerned by the risks of unintended escalation. This idea that we are going to see a replay of the wars of the 20th century is I think a nightmare, an unlikely nightmare. We know that both Pakistan's and China's strategies towards India have changed. Pakistan's, since the 1990s, has been firmly an irregular campaign. I mean, it began as an irregular campaign in 1947, and it's become a largely irregular campaign since the 1990s, obviously, even including the Kargil War. And since then, China's strategy against India, as it is against other territorial disputants, is a strategy of sub-conflict fates accompli, where it seeks to expand its position without going to war, without triggering a war. And this is, as has been said this evening and many times before. So let me then unpack why I see this as being essentially an Indian strategic choice, this two-front war. First of all, throughout history, I would argue that India has been the country that has escalated against its aggressor. So in every conflict, or at least in most conflicts, beginning in 1947, certainly including 1965, which I think is the archetype of my argument, where there was an irregular campaign launched by Pakistan, followed by a small conventional campaign. It was India that expanded the conflict greatly to a new front in Punjab, with a major offensive. In 1971, facing a cross-border humanitarian emergency, it was India that essentially launched a war in East Pakistan. In 1999, against again a non-conventional fait accompli in Kargil, it was India that planned a larger conventional escalation, which happily did not have to occur because the diplomatic path took effect. Even since then, it's been India's plans, as exemplified by Cold Start or IBGs or whatever you want to call it, to respond to subconventional provocations with at least the threat, if not the actuality, of a major conventional attack against Pakistan. So that's history. Secondly, I would argue that this idea is reinforced by current doctrine, which prescribes escalation to conventional war on the part of India. I've written recently about what I'm calling the orthodox offensive doctrine of large formations fighting at the operational level, meaning with minimal continued interaction or oversight from the political level, so largely fighting independently of political direction, and importantly, pursuing this concept of punishment against the adversary. This is the doctrine that I would argue has prevailed for at least half a century and still does. And this is the doctrine that would suggest that the way India responds to a non-conventional or subconventional threat is by escalating to a major conventional conflict. And finally, I would argue that in the future, this strategic choice will matter even more than it does now and has recently. And the reason I say that is because we're talking now about the threat of a two-front war, but I would suggest that India must take more seriously the threat of a three-front conflict if we are to also broaden the focus a little to include the Indian Ocean region, an area which is of, I would argue, greater long-term risk, albeit not the sort of immediate threat that India faces on its land borders. And the dilemma for India, the challenge for India, is that the persistent preoccupation with the two-front war comes at the direct expense of this third front, of India's position and posture on this third front. It is currently a distant third priority, and we can understand the reasons for that, but arguably over the long term and globally, it is geopolitically critical. So this idea that I'm putting forward of India's choice extends perhaps with even greater salience to the third front. I want to conclude by briefly suggesting that there are ways to escape this nightmare, but I would respectfully part ways with Brigadier Sehgal to suggest that it's not through an idea of greater punishment, but an emphasis on denial. So on the Western Front, it would be an emphasis on the denial of the terrorist threat, not only through punishment, and perhaps not even primarily through punishment, but through better denial in the security posture in high-risk areas, better force protection, just adhering to standard SOPs. Greater emphasis on non-military coercion, because we've seen things like the FATF actually affecting Pakistani behavior more effectively than Balakot. and through resilience, essentially, to take away the political impact of the terrorist threat. On the other side, on the eastern front or the northern front, I would suggest that denial could also serve to neutralize the threat of or at least counter more effectively the threat of a fait accompli through things like more effective wide area ISR, through things like more devolved command authority to local units, and through things like rehearsed TTPs for a rapid response to any intrusions. All things that we did not see around about April or May, but we did see subsequently around August in the Kailash range. And my final point is just to suggest that, look, this concern that we have over a two-front war, as has been rightly pointed out, has sustained a very large military establishment. And no one is right now suggesting that India should do away with that because, of course, this large conventional military establishment with the backstop of nuclear deterrence is working to deter conventional threats against India. The problem is that it does not equip India with many ready means for warfighting for the more likely scenarios that it faces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarpur. So I think what you brought out is that, high intensity sort of all-out war is unlikely. And you've also made an interesting point that, the choice of escalation is that lies with India. And it's because we've had a doctrine of punishment and escalation, and you quoted the 1965 war and the Kargil conflict. Whether that is equally applicable to China is something that we can look at, or was this doctrine sort of primarily devoted towards China? You also make the interesting point about Indian Ocean being a third front, and I think there is a realization in the Indian military that the Indian Ocean is going to become a future area of conflict. I think where problems lie are in the size of the defense budget, the size of the military, and ambitions not matching the money that is available in your pocket. And but there is a growing realization that the Indian Navy needs to be strengthened, that our posture in the Indian Ocean needs to be strengthened a bit. You also talked about a better strategy for India to escape this two-front trap, is a strategy of denial on both fronts. So we'll see if there are any sort of questions, but thank you. Some very thought-provoking ideas you've given out. So can I now finally request Avijnan, please?
Yeah. So thank you, Hapmand and Jankuda, for inviting me to this panel. This has been a very interesting discussion so far. What I'll do is that I'll start with the questions that were posed to all panelists. Essentially were along four axes, right? One is around a possibility of a two-front war. The other one is around capabilities. The third one is around nuclear deterrence in general, I would say, because conventional nuclear deterrence in many ways are intertwined in this case. And finally, the role of diplomatic and external actors and factors in the two-front threat that may materialize. So, let's start with the question of a possibility of a two-front war, right? Because as a couple of panelists have already pointed out, history really does not bear evidence to a collusive threat between Pakistan and China materializing. 1971, you have to remember that Henry Kissinger had actually reached out to the Chinese, all but asking them to do something during the India-Pakistan war. That didn't happen. Kargil, we know, Aisha mentioned it, didn't happen. So the question really to ask is, why are we worrying about a two-front threat now, circa 2020? Is, of course, Ladakh has been in many ways an eye-opener. But I would argue, and this I have done in a few recent articles, I would argue that there's a more conceptual reason why we have to worry about this. And I frame this in terms of what I call the frontier paradox. Because if you look at the history of India's relationship with Pakistan and China when it comes to disputed borders over the last 2 decades, since the end of the Kargil War, it has evolved, right? It has evolved because I would say that there was a first period that went from 2000 with all the outreach that I would say even 98 with all the outreach that Vajpayee made to Pakistan to somehow soften the line of control. Something that continued through back channel discussions also under Manmohan Singh. It didn't kind of work out. Mr. Modi comes in for the first term. There was outreach to Pakistan, and I would say I would really put the date in which this kind of this reach out to Pakistan have a sort of a soft LOC in the future kind of thing. The whole thing kind of falls apart in 2016 because you obviously have Pathankot and then Uri and things happen. So then what you've seen Mr. Modi begin with is this attempt to consolidate India's territories, disputed territories, disputed borders. Paradoxically, in the very process of doing so, such as with moves like the effective abrogation of Article 370 or ramping up infrastructure construction along the LSE, what you've done is that you've ended up making things worse, right? Which is why, well, along with things like pronouncements around Gilgit-Baltistan staking claims, so there is a frontier paradox that has kicked in, which is that the more India has tried in the last 4 years, assert its territorial claims, try to fix problems once and for all, the worse it has gotten. I would argue that that's one thing that has happened. One of the consequences of this, by the way, is that a two-front conflict, to my mind, is really a one-front conflict with two actors, right? Because you have, and where it really meets is in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, where you have the LOC meeting with Chinese claims. And so that's really the one front, to my mind, that one should be worried about. How do you rank order the possibilities? I think fellow panelists have already alluded to it. My rank ordering is in the way of most likely to least likely in terms of a two-front conflict. Most likely would obviously be something starts with China, Pakistan joins it. The second most likely would be Pakistan starts something and China joins it. Kind of not very likely. And collusive threat, I wouldn't really worry about it. Why wouldn't I worry about a collusive threat? China simply does not need a collusive threat, right? I mean, if you want to do something, there are many ways I can think the Chinese doing it without seeking the aid of Pakistan. There are also reputational costs that one has to figure out. So that would be when it comes to the possibility of a two-front conflict. Capabilities. You know, I've done a fair bit of work in terms of bean counting, in terms of budget analysis, decades worth of comparative budget and military budget analysis. And you kind of get to this point where you realize that these methods really don't reveal much at the end of the day, because military balance is very hard to measure, right? Net assessment in the style of the things you had the Pentagon under Andy Marshall doing, very difficult to sort of numerically get a handle on this. So depending on how you look at it, right? If you factor in geography, you get certain things, which is what a recent Belfast study did. If you do not factor geography, it's a pure bean count with some arithmetical manipulations, you get something else, which is what I did a few years ago. People would say combat experience. People would say, well, one of the things that tilts the balance to India's favor is China does not have much combat experience beyond the 79 war or after the 79 war with Vietnam. I would also argue that India also does not have combat experience to fight a large war after 1971 with Bangladesh. So it's very hard to measure that sort of whether India is ready or not. That remains to be understood a little better, right? But also it's very important whenever you talk about capabilities, right? It's very important to think about the theories of victory that both countries may have when it comes to a two-front, both countries meaning China and Pakistan would have when it comes to a two-front threat. What do they seek? Are we imagining a kind of a nightmarish scenario where both are seeking to make significant territorial gains, acting collusively against India? Well, it's unlikely, and which then brings me to my third point around the role of nuclear deterrence, right? Because look, irrespective of what the Indian official nuclear doctrine says, which is no first use, massive retaliation or retaliating massively, and so on and so forth. When the balloon goes up and there is even a small possibility that India will lose significant amount of territory, India will start issuing nuclear threats. It's not like, oh, but our doctrine commits ourselves to only retaliating in event of a nuclear first strike. Nuclear deterrence will kick in. It's very automatic, right? I mean, in terms of large territorial gains or large territorial losses, right? But when it comes to, again, kind of, General Huda mentioned, the need to explore the nuclear angle a little bit more. So just a couple of small remarks. Well, to my mind, whenever I think of the nuclear relationship between India, Pakistan, and China, I really think of two overlapping triangles. So one triangle would be obviously the India, Pakistan, China triangle, or a triangular relationship rather. But the other one is also where China is present, which is the United States, China, Russia strategic triangle. So you have these two triangles overlapping at a single node, which is China. And so developments, so if you look at technological developments that's going on in the China, US, Russia triangle, that's going to kind of cast a shadow on the other triangle. So that is one way of thinking about it. By the way, I mean, in many ways, if you, I mean, I would go as far as to say that certain elosification of the LSE may also mitigate nuclear worries, perhaps controversially, because if you see a situation where you have these skirmishes along the LSE, escalation doesn't happen like what happens on LOC. Perhaps there is some learning that happens on both sides about each other's red lines, and there's some possibility, right? Just with one concluding thought about the last point about the diplomatic and political factors. Look, I would submit that India's worry about a two-front war should be made into a Chinese concern about a two-front war that China faces, in that the name of the game would be to generate enough uncertainty in Chinese minds that in event of a war that China and Pakistan, or even China alone, wages on India, the United States or Japan or allies could also carry out an opportunistic exploit in the Western Pacific, right? So the point then is to come up with certain arrangements and certain mechanisms so as to create this worry in Beijing's calculations. So I'll just leave there. We can discuss a little bit more later.
Okay. Thank you very much, Abhidan. I think some interesting points. You talked about the frontier paradox, which to in some ways has also contributed to increasing tensions that have happened, frankly, along both the borders, and that is a reality. Your point about a one-front threat with two actors in Ladakh, I think is extremely relevant and valid, because that's the one area, frankly, and I was the Northern Army commander, the one real big worry when you talk about two fronts was actually, some kind of collusion taking place in Ladakh. Because all other borders are actually sort of independent, just facing one country. I think you also made a very nice point about how it could play out, and if there is a two front, what are the theories of victory? You said, is it going to be something that both sides are looking at massive territorial gains in order to achieve a sense of victory? And I think that's really not going to happen in a time and place like this. And of course, you talked about the nuclear deterrence and how it will play out. And an interesting point about how we need to sort of leverage our relations with other countries like the United States to bring in greater concern on China as to whether they would also, while fighting on the borders in the Ladakh and the Indian Ocean, also face some kind of pressure in the Pacific, along their own coastline. So I think very, very relevant and important points have been made. So thank you. And we can now, Gaurav, if we have any questions, we can take those questions.
Sir, I've requested, I think Dr. Shalini Chawla has a question, but because of the technical difficulties you're facing today, I'm not sure how to get her on screen.
Okay,
so
let me raise one or two issues with the panelists. So the sense I get is from all of you that a likelihood of a two-front threat where you will have massive fighting and conventional conflicts on both the fronts appear to be unlikely and may not happen, and therefore we need to sort of look at different kind of strategies to be able to control both the fronts. My question is to Brigadier Sehgal, if that is the contingency, are we therefore sort of hyping up this, or as cautious sort of military planners that there is a need to prepare for this kind of contingency, and it's not something that we can leave aside and say, listen, this is unlikely, and therefore we just need to do, as some people are pointing out, a strategy of denial on both sides is something that will work. Yeah, Brigadier Sehgal.
Yeah, thank you, General Huda, for this question. Okay, so look, while there is no, in my view, like I've all argued, that there is no question of full-scale two-front war or open hostilities. But what is important to note is that post May this year, the military costs to us, and something which Azan also talked about, are high rising. Our costs we are having to pay a large amount of military costs. Now, this is unfortunately is going to remain the issue. Like, for example, till such time there is a reasonable settlement with China, we are unlikely to withdraw forces from Ladakh. And similarly, we have also been forced to upgrade postures in other areas. As far as Pakistan is concerned, we are reasonably well off, but we have now launched into a massive overdrive of force upgradation, development of weapon systems, capability enhancement, etc., which is going to be a costly effort. So there is a price which we are already paying. But the reality of the situation again is this is that the Chinese believe, and this is their, I mean, that's our study indicates, when we follow China very, very closely, is the fact is that they are now looking at India not as a standalone power that we like to believe. We are a concert of powers that are part of a system which is posing a strategic deterrence to China. And to that extent, China is unlike to stop pressure on us. And this is going to continue to happen. In fact, there were some discussions recently in Delhi, is that the Chinese told us, look, you are locking up 60,000 of our very highly professional forces, and this is something which is unacceptable for a long, long time. So we said, what do you want to do? They said, okay, let's not talk about Ladakh, leave Ladakh out, and let's carry on with our relationship. We told them, no, it's not possible. So we are seeing from the Chinese perceptions and the feelers that they are sending is that things are hurting them, but they are hurting us also. It's something which we have to recognize. So the question basically is this: is that we have to. I tend to agree that we have to have a de-escalation strategy. We have to push the agenda to say that, okay, we don't want to do this. But the point is, it's not our choice anymore. In both cases, I disagree with the fact that India has the option of strategic of operational escalation. India exercises the option of escalation only as a retaliation or as a response. Is a response-driven option. It's not a direct first-line option. India does not initiate hostilities. If we have a cross-border war, if we have a cross-border terrorist situation, that is being created for us. If there is a problem on the line of actual control with China, China has initiated us. We did not initiate it. We were pretty happy with the peace and tranquility situation. So the question is, what are the strategic perspectives? And here we have to understand that China under Xi Jinping is trying to reel out his China dream at a much faster pace than was actually believed. And we are going to see, and if India is seen as a part of a four-cornered contest which the Chinese have to fight, the India, being a natural neighbor, will continue to feel the heat. That's my perspective.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Brigadier Sehgal. Dr. Aisha, I have a question for you. You know what it seems is on the Indian side, there is a great deal of suspicion that in case we get locked into a conflict with China, Pakistan is certainly going to try and take advantage of it, if not in a very large way, but certainly do something, for example, in Jammu and Kashmir. As you brought out, Pakistan looks at these things from its own sort of threat perspective and sees India as a danger, which is talking about Gilgit-Baltistan, the moves that have been made in Jammu and Kashmir. I'm only wondering, is there a way to sort of reconcile this, get a better understanding? And I know it's difficult. Is there a way to get a better understanding where I think threats on both sides, can be sort of minimized, or have we reached a position where, right now just not possible?
Right, General Huda, it's like amusing to listen to a conversation in which, the one simple description of a two-front war is that it's India on the receiving end. And that this is something China has imposed a threat on India. When the fact of the matter is that India on its side, on Ladakh, I mean, it's like taking all of you guys who already know the situation back to the ABC, just a reminder, a gentle reminder that, while China was building up, so was India. And when you build up, you do get into that lockdown where threats did increase. So firstly, it's not that, India is totally on the receiving end. And, referring to what Abhinav said, let's not forget that you cannot look at the China, Pakistan, India triangle without looking at the, Pakistan, China, India, and the US triangle. There are a lot of things which are building up. I mean, China is expanding. China is also expanding to reach out to Iran. But going back to how Pakistan looks at it, I firstly, I completely kind of tend to disagree. Looking at Pakistan, even from the lens of a two-front war, as a country which would be just simply led into war by China. There is, of course, the debt burden, but Chinese debt burden as total as part of total Pakistan's total debt burden is just 9%. So it's not as if, and the other thing is that this kind of a relation should be looked at, China-Pakistan relationship should be looked differently from, for example, China-Africa relationship or China-Sri Lanka relationship. China does not treat Pakistan as it would treat Sri Lanka. It cannot be led into a war. Now, what are the opportunities? I mean, let's assume with a border which is so heavily fenced, what are the advantages that it could take? I don't see a situation where, for example, there is this great war between, I don't think even China wants that. And I think it's understood in Pakistan that China has created or increased India's cost without actually increasing the temperature in terms of conflict. I don't see that there is going to be much benefit that even China can gain at this moment in building a huge conventional war that then opens up the region to a larger risk. I think where it continues to see, and I'm sorry at the risk of repeating myself, I think where Pakistan sees the benefit for itself is that while it has always been unable to increase India's cost of conflict, China can do it, not on Pakistan's behest, not even in consultation with China, with Pakistan, but independently for its own gains. I think where what we're looking at is not a situation where you find a lot of clarity. There are things, there are conflicts which will smaller bits and bits of conflicts that will kind of come into action as we move on. For example, I mean, there's been other colleagues have referred to the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, maritime threat, and I think one of the things that we need to look at, where you may have Pakistan, India kind of confrontation, perhaps, lack of better word, is a maritime sphere. Now with United States coming in, with China, US conflict, tension, the space is kind of so tight, and there's so many ships there that anything could occur. And I think that's where Pakistan would do hand-holding with China, but not use it to a point where it escalates. I can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your remarks. I have now some questions which are coming up. So there's a question from Dr. Chawla for Abhijnan. And she says, you talked about the possibility of India using a nuclear threat. So far, India has been consistent on no first use. It has never used the nuclear threat first. So what more, in your view, India could do or should do to ensure that the belief in its officially declared doctrine is maintained?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So, Dr. Chawla, the way I see it is that I always go back to this one Cold War study from the 50s, and the need to make a distinction between nuclear weapons for deterrence and nuclear weapons for defense, right? And the fact is, so far, whenever you see, as you very well know, whenever India talks about nuclear, it talks about nuclear weapons as political weapons, which it sounds like an oxymoron, frankly, that a weapon is a political weapon. So the fact of the matter is, it's a bomb, and it's a pretty effective one at that. So the point I was trying to make is very simple, right? So yes, so far for deterrence purposes, we would say certain things. For nuclear deterrence purposes, our nuclear deterrent concept does not even cover, doesn't reach out into conventional deterrence rather. But assume a situation where deterrence fails, conventional deterrence fails, and it fails very badly, and by some huge stroke of bad luck, we reach a point where we are about to lose territory, right? Or we enter into an attritional warfare kind of thing, we're losing a lot of forces. I think it's fair to say that because we have this 130, 140 odd nuclear warheads, that threats will go out. What should we do to make our extant commitment to no first use more stronger? I would say invest on our conventional deterrence capabilities. Because the more you invest on your conventional deterrence capabilities, the more you're telling the world, look, we are pretty robust conventionally. The nuclear thing can just sit there. The more you see this discrepancy and in the military balance between India and China, or however you want to calculate it, the more people will say, well, as a last resort thing, India will resort to nuclear threats, just like the way I have done. So I think my bottom line there is that link nuclear deterrence and conventional deterrence together without necessarily not having to give up your declaratory doctrine.
Yeah, thanks. I think you made some extremely important points. And it's also been sort of my feeling that, we've tended to keep, at least in India, the conventional part of war fighting and the nuclear aspects completely separate from each other. And that, to some extent, I think also impacts on how we are thinking about, nuclear issues. And whether we can, as you said, combine both the things and, come out with a more coherent strategy, particularly where deterrence is concerned. So thanks. I have a question for Dr. Tarapur, and this is from Elizabeth Trickwell. So her question is, what role do you expect third parties to play in the event of an active two-front conflict? And talking about third parties like the US, Quad partners, Russia. So would they have, and what kind of role would they sort of play? So not necessarily a grouping sort of which is anti China, which Quad is sort of considered, but also external countries like Russia.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I mean, my view is that it's a nice intellectual exercise to consider the possibility of, as Abhignan was mentioning, the possibility of enlisting Indian partners to pose dilemmas for China. So let me first take on the issue of the US and like-mindeds like the Quad. I think it's a nice idea to consider the idea of imposing those dilemmas on China, but realistically, my position is that groupings like the Quad certainly are a long way away from posing that sort of military challenge to anyone. At the most, at the best, and this is not insignificant, the Quad is a diplomatic grouping that is useful for signaling to China and to third parties around the region. And it could, in the case of a crisis, for example, not just sort of issue diplomatic démarches, which again are not insignificant in internationalizing a crisis. We've seen some evidence that suggests that Beijing might be sensitive to that. But at the most, what we would expect to see is a form of complementary activity rather than joint activity. So it may involve things like some sort of not very threatening but still usefully signaling military activity in the Western Pacific while India is engaged in a crisis on the border. The US, of course, is a slightly separate issue rather than, for example, a collective grouping like the Quad. The US is a separate issue because it has a pretty impressive capacity to provide enabling support to partners like India, and we've already seen that with the lease of the drones, for example, and the reports of intelligence sharing. For countries like Russia, though, again, I come back to this idea that despite what we may be hearing about increasing China-Russia military cooperation or security cooperation, I would suggest that it's a country like Russia that would be perhaps well placed to serve as a diplomatic channel rather than anything in terms of swaying the military balance. So the bottom line is that except for some peripheral enabling support from the US or from other like-minded countries, like, for example, Israel, India is unlikely to receive any significant military support that would decisively change the outcome.
Thanks, Saran. Thank you so much. The next question is for Brigadier Sehgal. And the question is that we are normally looking at a two-front threat in terms of geographical sort of collusion, military threats coming from both sides. But what are the implications, and which way would collusion in the non-kinetic domain manifest itself? And so, what implications could there be for India, both in times of peace and in times of some crisis like we are facing today? Yeah, Brigadier Sehgal.
Oh, thank you. One of the most important threat and which is currently being faced is the cyber. Cyber domain is going to become a big challenge for us, and we have already, as per our estimates, we have had some very major cyber attacks emanating against us from China as the conflict has proceeded. In addition to the cyber challenge, we heard a report of China trying to use EMP weapons against us. Of course, that was denied. That was not the thing. But the fact of the matter is that in about a couple of years back, I think about 7, 8 years back, we did an notional assessment of possible use of EMP weapons in a conflict with China, where we evaluated at least for 6 to 7 EMP weapon strikes against us, and what will be the consequences, damage assessments, etc. So these are some of the challenges that can come up in future. The issue of continuous gray zone operations, as they are currently going on against us, are currently going on both in the LAC and the LOC, is another reality. The whole bottom line of this is escalating the challenge without entering into any physical conflict. And there are multiple domains of that challenge being here. And like I said, tomorrow we probably also, while I have the floor, I just want to highlight one small point regarding the nuclear deterrence. See, it's important, while the explanation given are absolutely wonderful, but the point remains is that if India has to ensure the credibility of its nuclear deterrence, it has to improve its intra-war deterrence. Now, if India has to improve its intra-war deterrence, it has to start looking at the conflict from a slightly different perspective. We have to upgrade our non-contact capability. See what are the Chinese rocket forces are capable of doing. So similarly, if we can hold the front and the operational depths simultaneously within our ranges through our vectors, we would be able to create a much higher degree of dissuasion rather than simply fighting the war in the front. So the question which is intra-war deterrence is something which we have not looked upon. It is now that we have operationalized systems like Prahar, as the reports indicate, with a 250, 600, 200 kilometers range weapon system, and we might also upgrade to Pralay, etc. We should be in a position to create this upgrade our intra-war deterrence. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Brigadier Sehgal. I have one question from Ishtiaq Ahmed, and he says, we've already had many reports about, Dr. Aisha, this one is addressed to you. We've already heard many reports about Chinese having transgressed into Indian territory. On the other hand, the incidents of shelling on the border have considerably increased in the past. Pakistani drones are being spotted over Jammu region. And it's his view that the Chinese aggression, it seems, is being complemented by Pakistan's moves in the border area. Don't you think this is actually a collusion between Pakistan and China?
See, again, I'd be very careful using the word collusion. There is something which has separately happened between India and Pakistan on Kashmir. And yes, Pakistan would take that opportunity. It may seem that they're hand in hand, but which is certainly not the case. Where are the benefits for Pakistan to kind of expand the conflict? I would again not look at it as the two countries coming together, but definitely Pakistan trying to evaluate opportunities where it can perhaps keep putting pressure on India to step back from the move it has made in case of Kashmir. I don't see it as collusion, but that's my response to Mr. Ishtiaq Ahmed. And of course, the drones may have gone up. The number of drones may have gone up, and Ladakh is with Ladakh playing in the background. But I don't think that it's Pakistan at this point in time, because when Ladakh happened, in fact, let me point it out to Mr. Ishtiyaq Ahmed, that when Ladakh actually happened, there was very little movement. In fact, one of the concerns on Pakistan's side was that Pakistan was not doing enough to benefit from that situation. It is now kind of gradually and slowly trying to see where benefits lie for it. But again, it's not, doesn't make a case, case for collusion. One final point, and this is not in response to what Mr. Ishtiyaq Ahmed said, but it's an independent point. And I think that what we have not really talked about in so far is that what is the possibility of a conversation between India and Pakistan, which has gone completely dead? I mean, if there is this eagerness to avoid a two-front situation, or if there is, there is this seriousness of two-front situation, I mean, how about starting a conversation between India and Pakistan, be it back channel or front channel, whatever?
Yeah, Aisha, that's a very good point that's made. I think what we'll do is we'll take one question, and this can be answered by all the panelists. We'll try and end on a slightly positive note. So the question is from Peter Jones, and I'll request all of you, to take a couple of minutes over it, and we'll go in the same sequence as we had started. So the question from Peter Jones is, the panelists have all, to a greater or lesser degree, presented a vision of steadily increasing tension and weapons development. Are there any realistic steps which are possibly acceptable to all, which can be envisioned to reduce tensions and the need for greater military investment? So, are there any steps, which can, as Aisha also pointed out, which can actually get some dialogue on the table to, reduce the possibilities of a two-front side? So, a couple of minutes each as your closing remarks, and we'll start with Aisha.
Right. I think we are stuck at a point where situation is pretty tough that way. Each country, each region, and each bloc, I mean, and I'm looking at not just China versus India or India versus Pakistan. I'm looking at the blocks that each country wants to kind of build a strategic bloc. So India, US, Pakistan, China, Iran, Russia. I mean, these are the different imaginary blocks that are being constructed. And I think each wants to kind of benefit from it strategically. And there seems to be little, no point for each of them to kind of disengage from where they are. Also because the escalation or the tension that is increasing is also fairly manageable. But having said that, I think I'll go back to the point that I raised, that it's important to start a conversation bilaterally or, multilaterally. Use different forums. I think, for example, I see a role for the United States with Biden and as President Biden and his, forms a government. I think there is a dialogue to be had. There has to be some conversation. It could start a conversation. Again, the Russian contact can be useful, but some kind of conversation has to start. I would say definitely bilaterally between India and China, and definitely between India and Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Yeah, Brigadier Saigul.
Yeah, okay. In my view, I first come to China. In my view, we should be heading for some kind of re-evaluation of our earlier CBMs. But the problem now is that any re-evaluation that takes place will be in the backdrop of complete loss of trust. So the question basically is this, is that we would see some kind of a forward movement, And I see this happening during the course of winter. The stage will be set, and we would see some CBMs coming up, but I do not know the direction of those CBMs. For example, this whole issue of buffer zones, the issue of disengagement plans, etc., are going to be part of some kind of a CBMs. So the question is, how do we reevaluate those CBMs? How do we build trust? That's going to be the big issue. And so basically, the fundamental point of proceeding further is that two realities we have to take cognizance of vis-a-vis China. Number one is that diffusion of the situation probably is on the cards, but not immediately, but it'll take a couple of months. Two, that will lead to some kind of an understandings. You call them CBMs, whatever you want to call them, but the understandings will have to be a long drawn message and would have to be built on some kind of trust. And there, I think the political leadership will have a much larger role to play. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I totally agree with Aisha that we need to start conversation. We have been part of a track to dialogue. The person who raised this thing, Peter Jones, has been running this track to dialogue for a large number of years. Over a decade, I have been part of this. The question basically is this, is that how do we bring about the trust factor once again? The trust factor is vitiated by the fact is that everybody believes that there's a huge subconventional conflict which is being waged. Now the point is that subconventional conflict is basically aimed at creating facts on the ground which are against India in our sensitive areas of Jammu and Kashmir. So I think one of the issues that we need to look at for immediate diffusion is to go back to the situation of 2009, I think, when we decided not to use heavy weapons and heavy artillery, etc. And we try to create some kind of an understanding on that. And number two is to initiate back channels to not track to back channels where to some kind of understanding between the two sides to how to diffuse tensions between and I dare say that those back channels are also required vis-a-vis the Chinese. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yeah, Arjan, can we have remarks from you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Look, I would approach this question in a couple of different ways. The first point I would make is that there are powerful people and powerful interests in all three countries that benefit from this current status quo of tension. And obviously on the Pakistan side, there is a very powerful army that benefits from continued tension with India. And in China, there is the party's army that benefits from tension with India for its geopolitical ends. Arguably in India, there is a current government that benefits from othering countries outside India. But regardless of that, so that's the first point, that it would help if there was an incentive for these very powerful actors within each country to not see an interest in continued tension. But secondly, let me put on my academic hat and point out that the assumption implicit in the question is that tension and militarization raises risks and the prospect for war, okay? But there is another school of thinking in international relations that suggests that deterrence, that strength, can actually help to stabilize a situation. Now, I would suggest that that strength need not come from still greater military spending, still more weapon systems, still more men under arms. But military strength, national security, can come from new ways of thinking about national security and defense policy. Ways of thinking that compel in the adversary a realization that offensive action is futile. And so if countries like India which we're primarily talking about here, adopt new doctrines and new strategies that don't rely on a continued cycle of escalation and retaliation, but that instead seek to, again, I say, deny and thwart or foil the adversary's offensive action, then that form of defensive strength or military strength could actually serve to enhance deterrence and thereby bring stability. I just offer that as a thought.
Thanks, Azan. Yeah.
Hi. So I would sort of start by saying, of course, the need for talks between India and Pakistan. But before I explain what the talks could be about, just a remark, and I think one of the panelists already alluded to this, that listen, the very fact that the Indian political leadership since 2016, certainly, officially even before that, a few years before that, have steadfastly refused to talk to Pakistan, right? In many ways tell you that they possibly also don't take the threat of a two-front war very seriously, right? Because if you're genuine, and I think somebody already said that, because if you are concerned about this, yes, you'll do whatever you need to do to at least mitigate some of the challenges, right? But coming to the issue of talks in particular, look, talks will have to factor in tensions, the geopolitical circumstances, but ultimately talks will also have to be, or talks or lack thereof, will also have to, or will also be determined by domestic circumstances in all of the countries involved, India and Pakistan, right? Domestic circumstances right now do not permit India to engage Pakistan through a back channel of the kind that was employed when Pervez Musharraf was around, where there were talks of a soft border, making the LOC, soft LOC rather, making the LOC irrelevant and so on and so forth. Simply the domestic circumstances in India will not allow that. The public is in no mood for that. And we saw this very clearly when you saw overwhelming support for Modi government's decision on Article 370 on the floor of the parliament. I mean, you had opposition parties coming out and supporting it. So that is going to be a non-starter. Kashmir, talks around Kashmir is a non-starter. I can imagine talks around terrorism is also a non-starter, but for Pakistan's primary strategic reasons. What could be the talks about? I would submit that the talks need to be about communication of red lines. If these are track 2, track 1.5, red lines need to be communicated a lot more firmly. Because if you look at India and Pakistan, and to some extent even China, ambiguity is a virtue for all three sides. I mean, you look at Pakistan's nuclear doctrine, it's ambiguous, right? China has injected considerable ambiguity in its nuclear doctrine, in its first use, or rather no first use doctrine that we see. Even in the Indian case, simple things about where our thresholds are and so on and so forth are covered in secrecy, shrouded in secrecy, ostensibly for reasons of national security, but mostly, I suspect, as a way to preserve a certain military advantage by not communicating what your lines are. That needs to change. Because what has happened right now in terms of how India and Pakistan have engaged in the last several years is, I would say, in terms of what Thomas Schelling would call tacit bargaining, right? So there is a degree of bargaining that has happened. Often bargaining has involved high caliber artillery, but it's bargaining nevertheless. So there is a degree of learning by doing, which is very dangerous, as we know, because there is a risk of inadvertent escalation. And that in turn also stems from the fact that red lines have not been communicated to each other properly. So talks, track 2, track 1.5 talks, serious talks around red lines rather than on Kashmir or on terrorism.
So thank you very much. I think we've run out of time now. I just want to thank all the panelists. Extremely knowledgeable, very nuanced, viewpoints were given. I have nothing much to say. I think at the end of it, we can just sort of sum it up by saying that yes, India does face threat on two fronts. How it will manifest, I think, is not very clear. It's going to be an all-out conflict on both sides. There's going to be some kind of agreed on warfare. What kind of collusion will come from either side, and what will be the circumstances under which it will happen. I think much greater debate is sort of an understanding is required on this issue. But having been in the Indian military uniform myself, I think there is also a feeling, in the Indian military or in the Indian Army, can we sort of ignore this full-fledged two-front threat? And what happens if it manifests itself? And then, will we be sort of caught napping and not able to perform our duty? So as I said, I think a lot more debate is kind of required, not only in seeing how it will kinetically manifest itself, but also, in the non-kinetic domain. Where does, the nuclear factor fit into all this? Do we need to define our nuclear red lines? What role does nuclear deterrence play? I think these are issues that need to be debated and discussed a little more. And finally, I think what's driving all this, thinking about this threat manifesting itself now is deep suspicion about intent, from the Indian side, deep suspicion about China's intent now, about Pakistan's intent. On the Pakistan side, suspicion about the Indian intent. And as somebody brought out, the aspect of the fact that when India was trying to sort of consolidate its frontiers, even China, sort of saw it as, encroaching into areas like Aksai Chin, infrastructure development. So I don't know. As of now, it does not appear as if, there are great grounds where this deep suspicion can be allayed. And particularly, as also speakers have pointed out, that you have a large element of domestic politics sort of intruding into your foreign policy decisions. And so all this sort of makes for a bit of an uncertain mix. But as I said, I think much greater debate and discussion on this, and particularly, factoring in the nuclear aspect, needs to be done. With greater debate, maybe there'll be greater clarity on how we can actually meet these challenges and try and sort of mitigate whatever problems there are. So thank you all very much for your time, and I will just now hand over back to Gaurav.
Thank you, General Huda. I would just like to thank everyone for taking out time. And as Lieutenant Huda said, this was a very interesting discussion. So many different aspects of it were being discussed. And I think despite the technical challenges that we face today, this was very, very impressive. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you all the attendees and for all your very interesting questions. And we hope at CSDR that we can host you soon in the future for more such discussions. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.